Tonight we're going to talk about bad faith, the danger of religious extremism. In fact, that is the name of a book by our guest that's on the line right now. Dr. Neil Kressel is on the phone. Some of you might have heard of him. He's has quite an extensive bio. He's been in the media. And tonight we're going to discuss, well, obviously, are some religions and their doctrines and practices more apt to inspire hatred and violence than others? Are the people who commit horrible acts in the name of their faith carrying out or corrupting the true message of their religion? And what sorts of people are not prone to religious extremism? Well, Dr. Neil Kressel is a social psychologist, and he's a graduate from Harvard University. And he's going to draw on some modern examples tonight from Christianity and Islam to explore the psychology of religious fanatics and the dangers that they pose to themselves, fellow believers, and, of course, non-believers. Again, the number is 888-503-0802. Call me with your questions or comments. I'm in both the IRC room, okay, and obviously the Stickcam room, and you can type those questions in red for us so that we can relay your questions to Dr. Neil if you can't call in tonight. Again, welcome to the program, Dr. Neil Kressel.
Well, thanks for having me on, Reggie. I think that maybe it would be best for me to start by telling your listeners a little bit about my background, because pretty much when anybody talks about religion and when anyone talks about the lack of religion and about religious extremism, it's very important to know where they're coming from. And that without that, you really are losing a lot of the discussion. Some people kind of hide their personal beliefs until the very end of a book. Some people never tell you, and you've got to kind of figure it out between the lines. So let me try to be upfront with that. First of all, I was brought up Jewish from a liberal Jewish background, and in my teenage years, I got a bit more religious, but never very religious. And one of the things that turned me a little bit away from religion that I turned to was reading Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian. Because although I'm Jewish, I started to think that this is a very convincing book, and a lot of what he's saying about Christianity applies pretty much in the same way to Judaism. Since then, what's happened is that I do identify pretty strongly as a Jew from an ethnic point of view. That's my ethnicity, but I'm a skeptic in religious matters. I don't really believe a whole lot of the theology, and liberal Judaism is a fairly hospitable home for people who are non-believers. But even though they call themselves Jews, a lot of Jews don't really have very deep metaphysical commitments to the religion. To give you just a little sense of where my book grew out of, as somebody who was Jewish and growing up not too many years after the Holocaust, I had an interest in anti-Semitism. And academically, that was a lot of my early focus. I did an undergraduate thesis on the Dreyfus Affair in France, and then my second book was on the psychology of genocide. It was called Mass Hate: The Global Rise of Genocide and Terror. I wrote that in the early 90s. And at that time, I had thought, well, I've been studying psychology for a lot of years here, and I wanted to know what could psychologists tell us about Nazism. And my idea was to write a book sort of on the psychology of Nazism. But my editor said, well, if you're really able to talk about that, you should be able to talk about other instances of genocide in the world. And so that first book dealt with Rwanda, with Bosnia, with Nazism, pretty much from a psychologist and a sociologist's point of view. And right about when I was writing it, I was living across the street from the World Trade Center. This was back around 1993 when the first World Trade Center bombing took place. And so it struck me as I was working on that some of the distinctions between what we think of as genocide and what we think of as simply terrorism were starting to break down in the late 20th century. That, in other words, if a terrorist could destroy, and this was the first World Trade Center bombing, of course, didn't destroy the building, but the plan had been to collapse one tower into the other. And my thinking at the time was that if you could kill 10, 20,000 people with one terrorist act, then it wasn't going to be too long until the body counts from extremism, and in that case it was a religious extremism, were going to approach the sorts of body counts that we see in mass atrocities and genocide.
Right.
And so I included a chapter in that early book on Islamic extremism. And so my current book is really an outgrowth of the earlier one, where I started to bring together some of my interests in religion and my interest in mass atrocities, and asking the fundamental question of under what conditions can religion become a force so evil that it leads people to do horrible, horrible things to other people.
And that's what I was going to ask you. It seems like, in your research, when you were studying all these various atrocities, there was a commonality, I'm assuming. There's some what are some of the commonalities you noticed that brings about these type of horrific behaviors and acts? Well,
I think that if you asked yourself what was the one commonality that cut across a lot of the different atrocities in the 20th century, excuse me, and also the ones that we're seeing now in the beginning of the 21st, I think that the first thing that I would call attention to would be the acceptance of an ideology of hatred. And that this ideology of hatred could come from religion, but it could also come from things that were not religion. For example, the Nazis were not primarily religious in their motivation. They weren't at all religious. They were actually anti-religious. Even though many religious people became swept up by the movement, the ideology was not religious. And the communists also committed atrocities, and they had an ideology of hatred, but their ideology of hatred, again, was not a religious one. So it seems to me that religious extremism and the hate is really one variety of what I would call an ideology of hatred. And that some of the commonalities that we find in these ideologies of hatred is that there's usually a demonization of an outgroup. And that in religion, it's usually, let's say the infidel guy. It's usually the non-believer that becomes the recipient of the hatred. In other ideologies, it could be an ethnic group, it could be an economic group. So there are different types of ideologies. And that, but in this book, Bad Faith, what I'm looking at are specifically the religious ideologies of hatred. Now, I don't believe, as some non-believers do, that religion in itself is the problem. I think that if you're looking at explanations, for example, of Islamic extremism, which is obviously the one that's the problem, the current problem, maybe it's not obvious, but it's obvious to everyone, but it's obvious to me that in today's world, that's the one you've got to worry about the most. And that if you look at the way people speak about it, there's some like President Bush who say that it's really a corruption of what true Islam is. And in fact, whenever religious people do something wrong, there are some who are saying this is a corruption of true religion. True religion would only lead people to do good things, and so if they're doing bad things, ipso facto, it must be a corruption of the religion. Then there are those who say that the problem is not religion, but really the other guy's religion. So that, in other words, Christianity is not the problem, Judaism is not the problem, but Islam is the problem. Or Islam's not the problem, but Judaism and Christianity are the problem. And then there are atheists who often say the problem is religion in general. And I think that all of these are wrong. I think that to say that religion in general is the problem is to overlook the fact that there are many, many people over history who have used their religious beliefs to do good things. On the other hand, to say that religion is a force for good, that is neglecting the fact that within religions, particularly, well, within all of the major religions, and I think to a larger extent within Islam, there are messages which are loud and clear, messages that are hard to defend.